to join us here in the main hall. Next, I'm going to ask Emily Moore, Dr. Emily Moore, to introduce herself. And she's giving a talk about Wintertown.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back, Richard? He can. Yak Emily Moore yuchat duasak. Kitchkan Kud City. Idat Kua. Colorado yechat yati. Norway kwan dachkan. Atutchat jiaduatan. Achawe kiksadi ayachat. Kudanik yuchat duasak. Please forgive me for my mistakes, but I'm trying to use my introduction from elementary Tlingit. And I wanted to introduce myself as Emily Moore. I was raised in Ketchikan. I'm now at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I was honored to be adopted by Ray Wilson into the Kiksadi clan in 2014. So it's a pleasure to be back on Táakwání, the lands of the Taquan Khwáan. And I want to thank the organizing committee for all of their work to bring the Sharing Our Knowledge conference down to Southern Southeast. I think it's been a long time since SOK was down here. And as someone who grew up in Southern Southeast, I'm eager to see more scholarship down in this region. So today, my talk is about a village in the extreme southern of Southern Southeast, here on Annette Island. Am I showing, can you see my mouse? Yes. Táakwání. And I want to emphasize at the beginning that this is just the very beginning of this research, so I welcome feedback. I know some of this is sensitive information. I also want to emphasize I'm still researching how best to render this word Taquani in an orthography that honors the distinctiveness of the Tongass dialect. As we learned yesterday from James Crippen's work, the Tongass dialect does not have any tone. And so the common way to write Taquani from the Tlingit dictionary is to use this high tone long vowel, Taquani. But that doesn't exist if you listen to Frank Williams or Emma Williams, their recordings. They were some of the last speakers of the Tongass dialect, and they don't use those tones. So this is Jeff Lear's transcription of Taaqani, this kind of fading vowel, and this is Crippen's orthography for the same word. So I'm not a linguist. I'm still learning these diacritical marks and how best to honor that Tongass dialect. But this is Wintertown of the Taant'a Khwáan Tlingit at Port Chester, where Metlakatla is today. These are the two, considered the two last speakers of the Tongass dialect. I was fortunate to grow up my father was a close family friend of Emma Williams, and I remember her speaking about Metlakatla when it was a Tlingit village. So that really sparked this interest. This was a recording from Frank Williams, Gitwain, in 1974. And if you're familiar with Jeff Lear's work on the Tongass text, when he was recording a lot of the Tongass dialect. And Frank Williams told a really important story about Taquani. And I'd like to read this paragraph here. Taquani, Wintertown, that's an Indian name. Tlingit go there in the wintertime. Tongass, and I'm not sure if he's referring here to Tamgass, is on the other side of Annette Island. So this would be Taquani up here in Port Chester, and then down here in Tamgass Harbor, there was also an important village. There was sockeye salmon on the other side, and they moved to the Taquani side for a sandy beach so they could put up a canoe. A fine sandy beach, so they moved there in the wintertime. They called it Taquani, Wintertown. William Lewis Paul also wrote about this village. He was documenting in this book, The Alaska Tlingit, Where Did We Come From? the importance of Moira Sound on the east coast of Prince of Wales. And you can see here he wrote, Moira Sound had everything the Tlingit needed. What wasn't there could be reached by easy stages, say 20 miles per day. Taquani, winter village, so going from Moira Sound across Clarence Strait to Annette Island. Dasachwach at Cat Island or Village Island, right in this area. And then you could get over to Tongass Island, Kadukukha, and the Nass River was just a day's paddle from there. So that he was kind of charting the Taant'a Khwáan territory down in the southern end of Prince of Wales into Annette Island and Tongass. William Paul, I'm sorry for all the text, but I just wanted to be clear about some of the sources that I'm using here. So William Paul also wrote about this early town, the Taquani. He said, what is now New Metlakatla was formerly a Taquani town, founded by Kuchish, my mother's uncle. White men had named it Port Chester before it became New Metlakatla. Figuring 35 years to a generation, it would be 5 generations ago, or about 1800, when this village was established. Young people of that time liked Taquani, where a small sawmill now stands. It had a fine beach, good water, and safe harbor. It wasn't long before they began to stay longer. As the older generation grew older, they too stayed until the time came when Taquani became their principal town. And here I'm showing this photograph from the Sir Henry Wellcome collection. He worked closely with Father Duncan. I was very interested in the founding of Metlakatla, and you can see where the sawmill stood right on the point of Metlakatla today. So this seems to be the same beach area where Taquani. And here is an aerial view of Metlakatla from 1919. You can see these nice sandy beaches that Frank Williams was referencing, William Paul was referencing. And I also wanted to point out this Port Chester area. For those of you from southern southeast, you know this body of water of Clarence Strait can get really nasty when there's southeast winds especially. And so this was an important harbor, a kind of safe harbor to stay in while you're trying to cross Clarence Strait. And because it was a safe harbor, I've been trying to do research and finding old logbooks from the fur trade, different boats that would maybe have ducked into Port Chester when the Clarence Strait was stormy. So far, I have not found very many logbooks that seem to indicate that ships actually saw this village. But there's this one logbook that I found this summer at the Peabody Essex Museum, which was a center for so much of the fur trade from Boston, the Boston ships who were coming over. And there's this very interesting passage from 1824, which is in about the period where, remember, William Paul said Taquani had been established around 1800. We'll see in just a minute that it was burned around the late 1830s. So this is a likely period where the village might have stood. And this particular logbook from the brig Griffin, which was based out of Boston, and it sailed over to the northwest coast for the fur trade. But on Thursday, the 14th of April, 1824, this brig had been on Clarence Strait. It was trying to go down to Rose Point on Haida Gwaii, and it was too stormy. So they ducked into this anchorage, and they write here, anchored near the village of Taquan, 19 fathoms of water, morning anchored near the village in 15 fathoms, ends rainy from the southeast. On Friday the 15th, he's still tracking. This is his second day at Taquan. Commences rainy weather with fresh flay of wind from the east-southeast. Landed all the space, and I couldn't quite make out this word, opposite to the village. And then finally, on Wednesday the 20th, the weather cleared up and he was able to continue down Clarence Strait. when I was trying to figure out where this ship was, it seemed very likely that he could have been in Annette Island at Port Chester, and perhaps this was a kind of rendering of Taquan, which is another common phrase for this village. I don't know for sure, but so far this is the only logbook that I found that might reference some encounter with this village. We know from the early photographs of Metlakatla when the Ts'msyen arrived in 1887 that there were still poles standing from the former Tlingit inhabitants. And we saw this photograph yesterday in Steve Brown's talk as well, and he's extensively studied the poles that were at this village. One of his earliest articles tracked the poles from Taquani. And so here you can see this is another Sir Henry Wellcome photograph. He labeled it log cabins and other housing constructed by Metlakatlans for shelter during the first winter at Annette Island. Totem pole erected by former Indian occupants and later removed from the island. So you can see this very weathered pole sprouting spruce saplings or hemlock saplings at the top already. And by 1888, the following spring, the Tlingit poles that were remaining in Metlakatla had been prepared to ship to Sheldon Jackson Museum in Sitka, Alaska, where they are today. So this is a photograph, I think Steve also showed this yesterday in his talk, of these two poles, these two Tlingit poles remaining at Metlakatla. And here's one of those poles today. It's at the Sheldon Jackson Museum. Steve Brown has made a really compelling argument that this is likely the hand of Kajis du Acht, the amazing carver from here in Wrangell, Old Wrangell. I also wanted to point out the only other objects that I found so far from Taquani are these incredible house posts. They are back in the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York. And I know Steve Brown has also studied these, but I just learned about them a few years ago when I was at the Otsego Institute in Cooperstown. And if you look up the catalog record for these, you'll see that they're listed as coming from Taquan Village, Port Chester, Annette Island. They are beautiful poles. They also have a very strange history where they were at the Ballard Elks Club for some reason in Ballard and made their way to a gallery in Aspen, Colorado before being sold to this Thaw collection. So they're now back in New York. But they're just beautiful carvings, both the flat design on the wings of this raven. It seems to be an image of the famous image of raven stealing the sun. And these perhaps two different hands, as Steve Brown has pointed out when he was studying these at the Fenimore Art Museum. His notes are in their catalog records. And if you compare the two posts side by side, they have slight differences, especially in this kind of face of the sun that the raven holds in his beak. This one is a much wider, kind of fleshier face. Here are some details of those faces, but they're just gorgeous carvings. So knowing about the few, even from these few objects that we know were at Taquani, it seems to have been a really rich site for clan houses, for crest poles, for interior house posts like these. And I'd love to know more about this village. What happened to it? There are several records of the destruction of Taquani, probably in the late 1830s, maybe around 1838, 1840. And this is one record from William Paul. He wrote, "At the Chickaman River, a distance of 5 days for communication by canoe, a group of Nanya Ayi, or Wolf Clan, was in actual occupation. This branch group was called Xheel Khwáan, foam people, because the ripple at the mouth of the Chickaman River produces the foam Xheel. Their crest pictured the foam of the sea that bubbles and churns before drifting silently away. In the course of time, The tribal authority of the Nanya Ayi diminished from the Xheel Khwáan until it vanished as peacefully. The Fon people began to feel crowded by the Taquani, who had moved to Táakwání and built great community houses and totem poles. Against them, the Xheel Khwáan were helpless, and so they appealed to home at the Stikine Khwáan for help. So here you can see on this map I was trying to show the Chikaman River. There's some confusion. Ronald Olson talked about the Xheel Khwáan as well. He said that they were a Sanya Khwáan group, but William Paul and others have said the Xheel Khwáan were more associated with the Stikine Khwáan. And William Paul also documented this kind of split at this moment when the Xheel Khwáan wanted to attack the Taant'a Khwáan, and sheikhs of the Stikine Khwáan did not give it his blessing. This was William Paul's explanation for the kind of split of the Xheel Khwáan from the Nanya Ayi at this moment. So a war was going on between the Xheel Khwáan and the Taant'a Khwáan, as the Taquani, now at Taquani, was called. In a previous time, when the powerful sheikhs of the Stikine summoned the warriors of the Xheel Khwáan, they had not even responded. Now it was different. Now the situation was reversed. The Xheel Khwáan wanted help to fight the Taquani Taant'a Khwáan. Sheikh's reaction was typical and illustrates how new autonomous tribes were created. The Stikine at Willowtown, Kazatlan or Old Wrangell, was called into council, and the appeal of the Fon people was considered. The final speech was by sheikhs. The Xheel Khwáan are blood of our blood. They came from the same people as we of the Gunakaye, other side people. But when we sent them word to join us in our wars, they failed to answer, nor did they send an explanation for their failure. They have acted as if they did not belong. It is my opinion that they are an independent people, and they have created for themselves a separate place among the family of nations. Let it be. We will not make war upon the people of Tan. Ye away. That is the way it is. So this was William Paul's kind of explanation for the split between the Nanya Ayi and the Xheel Khwáan. And even though sheikhs did not give the blessing to kind of, or did not join this effort to war against the Taant'a Khwáan, the Xheel Khwáan, at least according to Paul and Ronald Olson, did choose to attack. And this is Paul's paragraph about this attack. So choosing a time when their enemies at Taquani were away at the Nass River trading for their winter's food, the Xheel Khwáan raided the empty village and burned it. When the Taant'a Khwáan returned, they found their village destroyed. Because winter was at hand, they moved back to Dasachach, sand all around, which is now called Cat Island over here. And it's Village Island right by Cat Island, if some of you have been down there. It appears that the Taant'a Khwáan lived at Dasachach for one generation, but began building better houses on Cotton Tree Island over at Tongass Island, which was closer to the Nass River. So he's charting this kind of migration of the Taant'a Khwáan from Taquani over to Cat Island, over to Tongass eventually. Frank Williams, Gitwain, he also told a really important story about the burning of Taquani. And this is in Tongass texts. If you want to read the whole story, I don't have time to do it all, to recount it all, but this was this key passage where he was talking about, I'll just read the English translation. When they were gone from the village, a different tribe came there. They burned it. No one was there. Only one young man saw that they had burned the town, and he ran off into the woods. And the story goes on where this young man crossed Annette Island to Tamgas Harbor and used a log to paddle himself over to Duke Island, where there was a fort. And he warned some of the other Taant'a Khwáan who were on Duke Island so that they could escape. George Emmons also wrote about this, the destruction of Taquani. He wrote, in the later portion of the 18th century, the Taant'a Khwáan included this family. I'm not sure if he was referring to the Ganachadi. It was driven out of the southern portion of Prince of Wales Island by the Haida, and crossing Clarence Straits, settled on Annette and adjacent islands. Their principal village was Táakwání, Winter Town, at Port Chester, where New Metlakatla now stands, and was a very large settlement, a totem pole village, as the decayed remains showed 30 years ago. In war with the Stikine, this village was destroyed, and also a later one across the island, Taqwani, Thimbleberry Town at Port Tongass, when they crossed to Cat Island and then to the mainland and made a last stand at Tongass, where they remained until the founding of Ts'msyen and Ketchikan. So there's Ronald Olson who talks about this as well. I don't have time to go into all of those sources. This was a newspaper article from 1888 in the Alaskan, which was one of the early newspapers based out of Sitka. And it was documenting the transport of those 2 poles that we saw that had been left behind in Taquani to Sheldon Jackson Museum. And it references this battle, or this attack. It says, the Elder, this ship, brought from Metlakatla 2 old totem poles consigned to Dr. Sheldon Jackson for the Sitka Museum. It seems that formerly the people now living at Port Tongass resided at Port Chester. 50 years ago, a party of the Stikines attacked and defeated them. The village was burned and the people driven away. The totem poles alone seem to have escaped the fire. Last summer, when the Metlakatlans took possession of the place, they found a few still standing. Having no interest in them, the poles were gradually being destroyed. The 2 remaining were secured for the museum. So this is interesting because it's an 1888 newspaper saying this might have happened about 50 years ago, around 1838. That correlates with the oral histories of Frank Williams and what William Paul and Ronald Olson documented as well. And then this is just one last note that I found from the Sheldon Jackson Museum, where they were documenting the provenance of these poles. This photograph had this note on the back of it that said, here's a Chilkat blanket, totem poles, canoes, tools, baskets, and nets on display. Also pictured are 2 totem poles from Metlakatla that were brought to the museum in 1888 when a group of young men from Father Duncan's Christian community came to the Sitka Industrial Training School. They were about to burn the poles when Sheldon Jackson arrived to bring the young men to Sitka and asked them to spare the poles and bring them to the museum. So anyway, I've been trying to go through, I'm running out of time, but I've been trying to go through and find other objects that could be from Taquani. And so far, I have not found any besides the 2 house posts and those 2 poles at the Sheldon Jackson Museum. This summer, I was fortunate to have a grant from the Terra Foundation to go to Europe and study some of the Tlingit collections that are in museums, including the British Museum and the Ethnologist Museum in Berlin. And I haven't found anything that might be from Taquani, but I just wanted to share a few photos of some really amazing objects that are from Tongass, so the Taant'a Khwáan people, but Tongass Island, a few decades after the time of Taquani. This was this naval, I don't know if it's a naval captain or if it's a Tlingit. It's portraying a Tlingit person wearing naval uniform. It's a gorgeous carving. Just to give you an idea of the scale here, I asked to pose beside it. It's almost life-size. It's a huge carving. And it's really interesting because it has these beautiful epaulettes from the kind of the naval captain's uniform, this gorgeous facial structure. You can see the compass dot that was used in the middle of the eye to create a nice circle of carving in the eye. The base of this figure is pretty flat. There's no kind of peg. I can't figure out if it was just cut off of the top of a totem pole. If it was originally attached to a canoe. I don't know where it came from, and there's no record of what it was originally part of. Also in Berlin, there are these incredible sea lion house posts originally from Tongass Island. And I just love this curvature of the top, right, to hold the huge house beam of the clan house on the top of the sea lion mouth. Beautiful chiseled carving of the teeth, the eye, the ears, and in the flippers animated with these gorgeous faces that were also carved in them. And then this is the last object that in Berlin, this beautiful little bowl. There's been some debate on Facebook whether this is a seal, a skate. Not totally sure how to interpret it. And it's also very strange because it's labeled as being from a Tongass artist, but it was picked up by Jacobsen in Victoria, British Columbia. And there were a lot of Taant'a Khwáan people went to Port Simpson and Victoria to trade, so maybe an artist brought this down there. He was very adamant that this was a Tongass artist that he bought this bowl from. But some of this interesting kind of cross-hatching, the little stippling of the paint reminds me more of a kind of Hiltsuk or Nuhalk, more central coast. So, here's his face. Amazing little face. I'm really interested in learning more about these southern villages. As I said at the outset of the talk, so much scholarship has been on Sitka and Taquan up further north, and all of that is incredible art. But I'd also love to see scholarship on the southern southeast, where there was a rich interchange between Ts'msyen and Haida. And so that was my interest in this Taquani, this early village of the Taant'a Khwáan. If you have any information or feedback, I'd love to learn more about the Foam people, the Xheel Khwáan, associated here in Wrangell, and any other information that you have for me would be welcome. Gunolchish, hawa, doiksan nuson.
So anybody have any questions? I'm wondering if you can comment on your repatriation process from foreign museums as to whether you have claims in and how that is going, and if you're getting the appropriate accommodation for repatriation of some of these things from the foreign museums.
Yes, that's such an important question. I should clarify, I'm not involved in any repatriation claims for these. I was just trying to identify more southern southeast objects that were over in British and German hands. As you probably know, there's no international agreement like NAGPRA that would require repatriations from international museums, but I think there are definitely examples of international museums choosing to repatriate objects. There was a famous example a few years ago. The Stockholm Museum repatriated, I believe it was a Heisla totem pole to Canada. And so there are a few examples, and it seems like there is movement toward repatriating things to their homeland. I don't know of any movement on these particular objects, but it'd be great to see these sea lion posts come back to Southeast. They're really gorgeous.
We have time for one more question.
Ndoiksin Shagat Limi Ts'msyen Dawayu Su Metlakatla Duawatku. My name's Shagat Limi Marcella Siksik. I'm from New Metlakatla. And I just wanted to say Doiksin for sharing this research that you're starting to do. I've always known that Metlakatla was known as Taquan before our people settled there on Annette Island, and I'm really looking forward to the more research that you do and share and following your work. I'm just curious if you're going to be talking more of are people who reside there now after you've completed your research on the Taquani. But Doikshishim, thank you very much for sharing this. I've learned a lot. I learned to know that the land that we reside on today, who was there before us. So Doikshin.
Yes, I skipped over one slide. Michael D'Angeli shared this with me, and I didn't have time to go into some of the Metlakatla oral histories that acknowledge Taquani and the role of the Taant'a Khwáan in welcoming Ts'msyen people there. This was a particular account by William Leask, who I understand was one of the early scouts of the Ts'msyen, who was sent up in the spring of 1887 to kind of do reconnaissance and find a space. And this particular account credits Chief Johnson, who is Taant'a Khwáan, for helping them find Port Chester and giving permission to land there. For the past 2 years of the pandemic, I've been trying to get over to Metlakatla to interview more people, and I would love to talk to you afterwards. And that's definitely part of this research that I'd love to learn more in Metlakatla itself.
Hello, Dr. Morse. Nice to see you. Welcome home. I really appreciate everything that you're doing. I came in a little late. Please forgive me. My Tlingit name is Khwáan Tlingit. I'm from Cake. My name comes from Cake. I was born here. I was born here in Wrangell. Origins here. But I like that you talked about the Chickaman River. As a teacher, when I post the Khwáns of Wrangell, the Chak Nachsati Ahwe Nanya Ayi Kakayash Kidatan Kasiknach Adi Kahuk Edi Xheel Khwáan and Chickaman River. And when I look into Thornton's book, I see that Esther Shea just says at the end, they went to Wrangell. And, you know, I would look at that and I'd think about that, but I had it posted. And then, Yech Nachsati, Awe, Wrangell, Taakwaání people, Kaskakwadi people, Kach Adi people, Kix Adi people, Teaton. And I just wanted to say those things right now. The Chickaman River was really interesting to me, and I really appreciate that you brought that out. It was nice to hear something about it that was researched. Ganachish.
I'd love to talk with you more too later, Virginia.
So thanks so much, Dr. Emily Moore. So now we have a lunch break, and it's and